Still have a couple more seats up in the front, if you're brave enough. Couple more seats in the front. We're going to go ahead and get started. A very timely presentation coming up. I recognize a lot of the faces from earlier today. So once again, I issue that apology for the scheduling conflict. Ms. Stephanie Bergeron Purdue is here. We have and are going to reschedule that presentation for an open slot. I think it is tomorrow. For everyone who signed on the sign-in sheet, we'll be giving you out information and let you know when that would be. And I promise you won't want to miss it. She would love the opportunity to reach out to everyone that came because, you know, she's definitely a little someone up about it. Moving on, we have Mr. Matt Thurlow. He is an environmental and complex commercial litigator with significant experience in toxic torque, contaminated properties, groundwater chemicals, and Clean Air Act cases. Following a stint as an environmental enforcement trial lawyer at the U.S. Department of Justice, he's also worked as an environmental defense attorney for over a decade, litigating complex environmental and toxic torque cases. He also regularly advises clients in the oil and gas, utility, chemical, and manufacturing spaces on environmental and consumer protection laws. His work has recently included advising chemical and consumer product companies regarding the use of disinfectant devices and sanitizer products to combat the virus and causes of COVID-19. He's also written and presented extensively on enforcement and emerging contaminants issues, including PFAS for the ABA, Bloomberg, Pratt's, American Law Institute, Environmental Law Institute, and other industry and academic organizations and publications. He's also worked to solve legal problems at any size of a response. To solve legal problems of any size with a responsive, pragmatic, aggressive, and business-oriented approach focused on the clients and the needs of long-term goals. Portions of this profile may constitute attorney advertising. Any testimonial or endorsement on this profile does not constitute a guarantee, warranty, or prediction regarding the outcome of the legal matter. Prior results do not guarantee single outcome. I love it.
That's always the LinkedIn disclaimer that I'm legally obligated to provide with any attorney advertising.
From a full approach, we'd like to thank you guys for being here. Please welcome Mr. Matthew Thurlow.
Thank you. So it's a pleasure to be here again. It's been a few years since I've been at the HSE Conference. A few things have changed. We have a new administration, which has obviously now been in office for over a year. So it's a great time to actually take a look at what the Biden administration has done. In fact, they released their proposed 2023 budget about a week and a half ago. That provides a lot of insight as to what the Biden administration wants to do with respect to environmental enforcement. It undermines many of the points I had planned to make today. The theme of my presentation today is to ignore a lot of what the administration says that it's going to do and the policy language that is used in describing environmental enforcement at the federal level, and to actually look at the long-term trends, because I think those are more important in providing a picture of what's actually happening on the ground and over time. And what you see, over time, is that environmental enforcement at the federal level has actually dramatically declined. So in the proposed 2023 budget, there are many statements about how environmental enforcement is going to increase during this administration. They're going to hire up, employ thousands more folks on the ground. They're going to be pursuing environmental justice issues. They're going to be pursuing PFAS. But what I would tell you is, if you look at the long-term statistics, there have been fewer inspections than ever before. There have been fewer civil enforcement cases brought at the federal level than ever before. And there are fewer cases for a few basic reasons that I'll get into later. More of EPA's focus over time is on bigger cases. So cases like the Deepwater Horizon case, cases like the Volkswagen emissions defeat device cases. Those billion-dollar-plus cases is where EPA has been investing more resources, and there's fewer of the smaller, annoying gotcha kind of cases. That's because there's been improved compliance tools. EPA has been working hard on electronic reporting, and I actually think some of those measures are starting to be effective in terms of both increasing compliance and having fewer unintentional violations. But it's also a question of a division of responsibility and EPA's attention versus the attention of states and local governments. There's been more deference over the last decade to state agencies to do a lot of the enforcement. But let's take a look at the numbers. The numbers are pretty dramatic when you look at federal inspections. There were over 20,000 inspections in 2010. That dropped to 15,000 by 2015 during the Obama administration, 11,700 in 2017. In case anybody thinks that it's a little hard to see, the most dramatic drop to 2021 was less than 4,000 inspections. That's not all the result of COVID, because in 2019, it had already dropped to 8,000. So the number of inspections is really important to think about environmental enforcement, because these federal inspections, EPA agents on the ground, going to facilities, auditing, looking around, is what results in civil enforcement in many cases. And when you don't have boots on the ground doing inspections, you're going to have fewer civil enforcement cases and criminal enforcement cases. And we've also seen that maybe a little bit less dramatic. The number of civil enforcement cases brought has dropped from 3,500 in 2010 down to about 2,400 cases in 2015, down to only about 2,000 cases in 2017, and 1,700 cases in 2021, which was a slight uptick. But what you can see is a very clear trend line down, which is not necessarily good for somebody, a lawyer that does environmental enforcement work. I'm talking about how my work is, unless I get hired for the Deepwater Horizon case. Similar trends in criminal cases, and this is something that the Biden administration has been particularly focused on in saying they're going to bring more criminal enforcement cases. And I think we have seen, particularly in the context of pesticide regulation, more criminal enforcement in the last few years, but it's not particularly material. There have been fewer than 200 cases brought in the last 5 to 7 years. I think the number of cases brought in 2021 was around 150. It's something to keep an eye on because of the stated intention of doing more criminal enforcement. But on a day-to-day basis, it's still pretty rare to see criminal cases brought. That's because criminal cases require a significant investment of resources. Require a number of agents, a number of lawyers to investigate and bring the claims. They're much more difficult than the civil actions. As you may remember, a lot of the civil actions, you think about the Clean Air Act, think about the Clean Water Act, think about the hazardous substance statutes. Those are strict liability statutes. So most of the time, the violation is self-reported, and it's a very clear-cut case that there has been a violation of the statute. All EPA has to do with that is try to resolve it directly with the violator, or in cases where they can't reach a resolution with the violator, they refer it to the Department of Justice. Criminal cases, there are issues of intent involved. Did the company or the individuals involved in the violation knowingly break the law? A much, much more difficult standard. So those cases are fewer and increasing in terms of EPA's focus on them slightly, but still not material. So let's talk about some of these trends that I was mentioning earlier. You have significantly reduced environmental enforcement over the last decade and even before that. And it coincides with a smaller EPA. EPA had over 18,000 employees in 1999 at its peak. And thank you. The number of employees steadily dropped over the last decade, bottoming out at about 14,000 employees. There was an effort during the Trump administration to encourage voluntary retirements, and there were some buyouts. Those were not as successful as I think the Trump administration was hoping. Former Administrator Pruitt had actually said he wanted to cut the number of EP employees during the Trump administration, the first term, in half. So that nothing like that happened. But you do see a steady decline in the number of employees. There have been some indications that the Biden administration is going to try to increase that slightly, but I actually think it's likely to remain pretty flat. You might see a few more hundred employees, but I'd be surprised if it was more than 1,000 new employees coming in during this administration. And then I expect over time, the number of employees is going to continue to drop. And I'll tell you more about that in a moment. EPA budget is another issue to look at over time. The budget has been very flat, and actually that $8 billion budget that we've seen over the last decade really goes back to 2002. So if you're thinking about inflation, that's been in the news, the level of inflation at 5% right now, it's been pretty low for a while. But even with low levels of inflation, if you have an $8 billion budget with a couple of spikes here, then you're actually spending less in 2017 than you were in 2002. Of course, in the spirit of undermining my presentation, EPA released its 2023 budget about a week and a half ago, and that budget was much bigger than what we've seen in the last decade. It was almost $12 billion, 25% more than what it was in 21, and 2022 was actually flat, similar to about $9 billion. So a proposed EPA budget of $11.88 billion. That is a proposed budget. That is not the final budget. I think it's quite likely that that proposed budget is going to be trimmed. President Biden has to get this through Congress. We've got a Democratic controlled Congress, but it's pretty evenly split. And it wouldn't surprise me if this is narrowed back down to closer to $10 billion. And then, of course, I do think the long-term trend for EPA's budget over time is that this is going to continue to remain pretty flat. Maybe it will level out at $10 billion as opposed to $8 billion. So why is the EPA workforce declining over time? One of the issues is that EPA has had an aging staff. A lot of the folks at EPA came in the heyday of EPA in the 1970s and early 1980s and have worked at EPA for 30 plus years. And those folks are rapidly retiring. About a quarter of them were at retirement age in 2019, and about half of them are expected to reach retirement age in the next few years. Those folks are leaving in droves. I wouldn't be surprised, I don't have statistics on this, but I wouldn't be surprised if many of them left during the pandemic, as we saw across the workforce, older workers who have built up their 401ks, deciding that now is a good time to retire. And those folks are being, during the last administration, those folks were not replaced, and that was intentional. During this administration, there is an effort to replace a number of those individuals, but I expect that they'll basically tread water at EPA in terms of their overall number of employees. And when you look at the employees, let me go back here, the employees that they're going to be replacing, you have somebody who has 30 plus years of experience with the Clean Air Act. And then you hire a fresh-faced college graduate, 22 years old, 21 years old, who's got no experience. So EPA is going to have a major transition here over time as they replace their most experienced employees with brand new employees who don't have the background with the statutes. It remains to be seen, what that's going to mean in terms of the regulated community, if you're going to see more mistakes, if you're going to see potential overreaching. It's possible that you may actually see the reverse, and the retirements are going to provide opportunities for new folks on the career side to be elevated into leadership positions, new millennial employees who are more comfortable with technology and embrace some of the new technology that's available to the agencies, new millennial employees that have maybe a different perspective on enforcement and don't view the agency's mission quite the same way. Millennials are actually quite known as a Gen X person, I can say millennials are known for certain things and speak down to them. But I can also compliment them because they have characteristics that the boomers and Gen X folks don't have. And one of the attributes of the millennials is that they're intensely collaborative. And that might actually be a really good thing for the regulated community over time, is to work with an agency that wants to solve problems and doesn't necessarily view itself as a hammer. So that is something to keep an eye on at EPA over the next few years. So now I want to I'll transition a little bit into sort of what we saw at the end of the Trump administration and how that impacted environmental enforcement, and then what we've seen in the first year of the Biden administration. This has been a really unique time for the country, living through a pandemic. EPA enforcement was not insulated from global events. I think you have seen a drop in inspections. I think you have seen a drop in some civil enforcement because of COVID-19 and the difficulty of collaborating together in an office, difficulty of getting on site to facilities that may have been closed. But again, remember the long-term trend line. Not all of that was COVID-19. So the Trump administration issued, you may be familiar you may have heard about this in the news at the time, a COVID-19 environmental enforcement policy right around the time that everything was shutting down in March 2020. The policy, quite frankly, was a little bit vague. It was, I think, an effort to show that EPA was sympathetic to the issues facing the regulated industry, and that they would understand that folks could not engage in normal monitoring and reporting, and that they would have a potential defense to raise if there was non-compliance. I think the problem with the policy was that it didn't provide any guarantees, of course, about non-compliance. And so I would never have advised a company to stop their regular monitoring and reporting during this period of time. So this is highly controversial. A lot of folks thought that they shouldn't have come out with this policy. It was only temporary. It went into effect in March and then was terminated in August. And that was obviously, unfortunately, not the end of the pandemic. And hopefully we have seen the end of the pandemic now, 2 years later. One area that I want to emphasize that was not really subject to decreased civil and criminal enforcement, it doesn't relate to the area issues that are more the focus of this conference, but I think it is really important from the perspective of environmental enforcement, is pesticide regulation. If you're an in the environmental enforcement community, whether you're a consultant or a lawyer, and you were not familiar with FIFRA, the federal pesticide statute, you are probably now familiar with FIFRA. It has been incredible, the amount of enforcement brought by both the Trump administration and the Biden administration to protect the American public from dangerous pesticides, from companies who are engaged in the sale of pesticides and who really didn't know what they were doing. That never dropped off. About a third of the, I said 1,700 cases were initiated this past 2021 fiscal year. There were over 600 of those cases involved pesticides, which just is an unprecedented number. So if anybody here is thinking about jumping into the pesticide market, I would say, number one, you're a little late. And you've got a lot of competition now. And number two, be very careful because it's a highly regulated area. I've worked with a number of clients here who didn't know what they were getting into and have had major problems with EPA. So let's transition into the Biden administration. The Biden administration comes in January 2021. And what did we see in the first year of the Biden administration? I was frankly very surprised by the slow out of the gate policy changes made by the Biden administration. Really didn't start seeing any of the policy pronouncements until late in 2021. And we haven't seen anything reflected yet in terms of civil enforcement, in terms of the Biden administration sort of changing the direction or trajectory of what the Trump administration was doing. Part of that is a function of the long pipeline to take a civil enforcement case from beginning to end. You don't finish a civil enforcement case starting with an inspection and litigate it through trial in a year. It's a multi-year process. And so you might see more of the administration's fingerprints on enforcement statistics next year and in 2023. But you didn't even really see it in the budget, which remained flat last year. So they weren't even really trying to make the major leaps in enforcement until they announced the recent 2023 budget. So we see civil enforcement cases continuing that trend line down, and criminal enforcement remaining pretty negligible. One very surprising policy issue on the enforcement side that we saw from the Biden administration, there was an early announcement that the supplemental environmental project policy was likely to be reinstituted. So the supplemental environmental project policy is a policy that allows in settlement violators to perform environmentally beneficial projects as opposed to paying civil penalties. And the regulated community, most of the regulated community likes SEP policy because you can turn a negative into a positive. You can do something, an environmentally beneficial project in the community. You can generally get good press on that project. And it's such a more palatable thing to do than just to pay the US Treasury a few $1 million. That policy went away towards the very end of the Trump administration. There were a couple of memos issued, and then there was a regulatory effort to put up some roadblocks to make it more difficult to reinstitute the policy. But I have not heard of any real effort by the Biden administration, even though this was identified early on as something that the administration was likely to do to reinstitute the policy. The SEP policy is still in effect over at EPA. So if you have an administrative settlement, you can still get a SEP. But if you have a judicial settlement with the Department of Justice, you cannot have a SEP. So let's talk a little bit more about the 2023 budget and why I am a little skeptical that we're going to see it come out at 11.8 billion. I think there is some politicizing that goes into proposed budgets. It is the proposed budget I view as a policy document that emphasizes the priorities of the administration, and sure enough, that's what this budget does. There's a lot more funding for things in this budget for environmental justice, for climate change, for other policy priorities of the Biden administration. The 11.8 billion reflects the administration's commitment to EPA. And you saw a sort of similar on the other side of things situation with the Trump administration, where they said, we're going to slash the budget. We're going to cut it way back. And they proposed a budget in 2019 of 6.1 billion. I think the 2018 budget was similarly slashed to about $6 billion. In both cases, Congress restored the budget back to $8 billion, because cutting that much of EPA's budget turns out is really painful. A lot of EPA's budget is going to grants to states, to tribes. And if you cut that budget, Congress people don't like it because their constituents are hurt, and they get phone calls from their constituents. Why did my grant disappear? And so Congress has a tendency to restore these budgets. When you talk about an increased budget, there might be less pressure on Congress to reduce that budget, but I suspect because a lot of these are policy-oriented budget items, like environmental justice, that there will be pushback, and climate change as well. There'll be pushback from conservative Democrats and from the Republicans on a lot of these budget items saying, why do we need $200 million for this new initiative? Why do we need 300 new employees to be doing this issue? EPA, prove that you actually need this funding. And I think, some of these ambitious items will drop down from the proposed number. So what's included here? 1,900 more employees, $150 million for compliance monitoring. So by comparison, that's almost a 50% bump from 2022. And $213 million for civil enforcement. Again, more than a 20% jump, 25% jump from 2022. Criminal enforcement, is a 30% plus jump. I do think some of these items they might get a little bit more budget for, but let's look at the other items that are a little bit more policy focused. Drinking water infrastructure, 1.2 billion. That's good sort of pork barrel stuff. So, Congress people might like that. You might see that come through. Evaluation of PFAS is an interesting item because if you've heard about the PFAS controversy, those are the chemicals that were used in Teflon and Scotchgard. There's been a lot of EPA focus on drinking water contamination with respect to PFAS at military bases. And I do think there may be some bipartisan support for that one. Environmental justice, however, if you look at those numbers going from 11 million to $300 million, I'd be very shocked if they were able to get that much money for environmental justice. I just don't think that there is going to be the political support for it, even acknowledging that this is, from the perspective of many Congress people, worthwhile to invest in. So now I want to talk again, sort of going back to some of these long-term trends and why EPA's budget is going to sort of continue to probably remain pretty flat, why enforcement numbers overall are going to decline over time, why you don't necessarily need a bigger EPA with more employees, and why states and tribes are going to be more involved in enforcement long-term. And a lot of this, from my perspective traces back to next generation compliance, which was an initiative adopted originally by the Obama administration in January 2015. And it's defined as increasing compliance with environmental regulations by using advances in monitoring and information technology combined with a focus on designing more effective regulations and permits to reduce pollution. So there's sort of two elements to keep in mind here. One is leveraging technology, right? We have better and better technology to reduce pollution. We have better technology to monitor and solve the problem that we've had with compliance with technology. Second part of this is focused on designing more effective regulations and reducing the regulated community's confusion with respect to how to comply with the law. That's how you also increase compliance. You make the rules clearer. You don't have a regulation that only an engineer with a PhD could understand. You have common sense regulations that are easy to understand, that the folks running a facility can understand. Also not necessarily a great thing for lawyers, by the way, that the regulations are easier to understand. So Cynthia Giles was really the architect of this. And she says it was next gen is about writing rules that work well and that achieve the desired result without requiring court action. So EPA understands that litigating these issues is a major drain on the government's resources as well. And what they want is compliance. They don't necessarily want to be the hammer going into court and take, there are also negative effects, when you talk about going into court to get a resolution on an environmental issue. It takes years. Are you able to get compliance during that whole period of time that you're litigating the issue instead of solving the problem? It's not really an effective use of resources for the agency, and it's not really an effective use of resources for the company. Those resources can be devoted to compliance rather than lawyers. Again, not a good thing for lawyers. Trump administration, what were they going to do with next generation compliance? I had this big question mark when I saw the Trump administration come in. Were they going to reject these principles? Because this is Obama era policy. And when you think about it, a lot of this is not really partisan. This is common sense. And a lot of it ties clearly into what the Republicans had been trying to do with EPA for decades, making it a more efficient agency, making it less, reliant on top-down enforcement, increasing voluntary monitoring and compliance. So while the Trump administration sort of rejected the language of next generation compliance, a lot of the policy work that had been done by the Obama administration remained in place. A lot of the principles and a lot of the reporting, all of the reporting tools, basically the whole infrastructure of next generation compliance was adopted by the Trump administration. And now, of course, with the Biden administration, they've continued to keep in place these tools and then, brought the language back. So you'll see next generation compliance everywhere on EPA's website again. And so what are the different sort of subtenets of next generation compliance? One is technology using the most advanced environmental monitoring compliance tools. Baseline monitoring is a good example of a technology that can be effective in monitoring compliance. Infrared cameras, artificial intelligence, advanced flaring and leak technologies. Things like drones can be used by facilities. They can also be used by EPA. It's sort of the interesting thing with a lot of this technology is that some of it comes in on the company side, and the companies are implementing these technologies, and then some of it is also come in on the EPA side. And EPA now increasingly is using these technologies to monitor facilities. So EPA has drones, and EPA is requiring fence line monitoring and consent decrees if facilities don't already have it. There's a focus on cost savings here and reducing delays in sharing information. And EPA has had an emphasis, particularly in the Obama and Biden administrations, in making information available to the public. And that making information available to the public about facilities, has both benefits and drawbacks. EPA views it as a way of almost public shaming, and you get the story out about a facility, the public becomes aware that a facility is non-compliant, and that's bad PR for the company and the facility, and that will increase compliance by doing that. I think from the company's perspective, there are some concerns about sharing this kind of information, which could be inaccurate. It could be sensitive and proprietary, and you could have sort of unexpected results with members of the public who don't fully understand information, having access to it and misinterpreting the data. There's been increased reporting and self-auditing. This is a major part of next generation compliance, and it really streamlines the process of reporting information to the agency, to EPA. You report lots of violations now just directly to EPA's central data exchange. Having used the data exchange, I would say that the best word to describe it is a little weird, quite frankly. You submit information to a database about your client. Your client has to make a very difficult decision about whether they want to report this information to EPA. It's a business decision in some cases. It's an assessment of risk. And you don't know if EPA has gotten the information, if a human being on the other side is looking at the information, and what EPA is going to do with the information. If you hear nothing, that is the ideal outcome. But there are, I think, always concerns about, so I report this to the Central Data Exchange, and then 2 years later, I hear back from the agency when I haven't held on to any of my data and in a far less good place to defend myself. So I do think some of these tools are going to continue to be developed, and we are seeing that actually with new generations of tools. They just updated the Clean Air Act reporting tool recently. I do think that EPA is auditing, and it's not just going into an empty mailbox somewhere that nobody looks at. But it's not clear exactly what the process for auditing self-reported violations is. And I think with artificial intelligence, there might be more auditing, and quite frankly, the risks of self-reporting might increase because if you self-report, you're probably more likely to be spotted or flagged by EPA. So there really was no appreciable drop off in terms of the development of these tools during the Trump administration. The Obama administration set deadlines, and with a couple of exceptions, the Trump administration continued to implement this, and the Biden administration is continuing to implement this. Increased transparency, I'd already talked about this a little bit. EPA is also sharing more data with the states, tribes, and the public. There's third-party verification opportunities, and there's potential for use of informal enforcement mechanisms, the PR that I mentioned earlier. I'm going to skip this slide. Well, why don't I talk real quick about some of these enforcement priorities, because I haven't really gotten through them. But obviously, the Biden administration is intensely focused on environmental justice, looking at the implications of enforcement on low-income and historically disadvantaged communities. They're focused on climate reporting, and particularly with climate in the civil enforcement context. EPA has been looking at HFCs, which are, I believe, a refrigerant, and there's a new basically rule that bars the use of HFCs, very high greenhouse gas potential, so they're much worse for the atmosphere than carbon dioxide or methane even. And that's one of the issues that's been targeted for additional enforcement, especially making sure that they're not imported into, HFCs aren't imported into the United States. They're also looking at diesel engines, and there's a lot of resources earmarked in the budget for addressing that issue. I mentioned PFAS. Lead remains a high priority for this administration. A lot of money has already been earmarked for lead, and there are going to be revisions to the Clean Water Act rule. There was actually a ruling by the Supreme Court this morning, which left in place the Trump administration's definition of waters of the United States while this issue is litigated. So that's pretty timely.
That would be lead in drinking water.
Waters of the United States. Oh, lead and PFAS is mostly focused on drinking water. There's also likely to be regulation of two PFAS chemicals, PFOA, which was the Teflon chemical, and PFOS, which was the Scotchgard chemical, the original Scotchgard chemical, as hazardous substances under CERCLA, which is going to be hugely expensive, for anybody that has this kind of contamination on their property. That with the CERCLA designation, there'll be requirements to clean it up. So I want to talk a little bit about, again, a long-term trend here. A lot of the major environmental statutes are based on the principle of cooperative federalism. So it's the idea that you have a federal law that's implemented largely by the states. So you have permitting programs under the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act. And those are based on the federal law. The state develops much of the individual regulation and then implements it. There's been more of a move away from federal oversight under all these federal laws and towards state oversight of their own programs. So that when the EPA and DOJ bring a lawsuit under the Clean Water Act or the Clean Air Act, it's typically for violating one of these permits. And they call it overfiling because you're basically going over top of the state and saying the state's essentially not doing a good enough job in managing its own regulated community here. And so there's been more of an emphasis on, I think, deferring here to the states. That's not just the Trump administration. And, they're much more concerned about this, I think, on the Republican side of things. But there's also been a lot of emphasis on more deference to tribes and states and local partners on the Democratic side and with the Biden administration. You also see this on the environmental justice front, where a lot of the resources that are going to be spent at the state and local level. And much more of an emphasis on partnerships for key environmental issues like lead and PFAS, holding national summits where state and local partners come in. And I think this reflects an understanding that we're seeing more localization in terms of both regulation and enforcement of environmental law. Increasingly, state laws are more important than what EPA is doing. Part of that is the stalemate that we've got in Washington, and we don't have a lot of new federal legislation that might improve some of the existing statutes that we have. So we have more states that are taking the lead and aggressively legislating and bringing new laws. In some cases, not necessarily with the best scientific evidence. In some cases, there's a lot of disagreement between states and disagreements about what's safe and what levels of risk there are. I think it's changing the dynamic in terms of how national companies have to manage their problems. If you're selling a product in all 50 states, you've got to be aware not just of what EPA is going to do with your product, you've got to be aware of what a Washington state is doing and what California, it used to be maybe you had to worry about California. Everybody's always been worried about California. Now you really have to worry about Washington State, New Jersey, New York, Massachusetts, Oregon. There are a number of states here that are aggressively moving the ball, and you have to decide, am I going to handle my product differently in those jurisdictions? Am I going to manage my facility differently? Am I going to move my facility? How am I going to address that? Or am I going to now meet the floor nationally that has been set by a Washington state? And that's, those are tough business decisions. I think it leads to some questions about an uneven playing field and deferring standards that are sticky. And then, I think sort of looking at this last slide, which is a little cut off, some of the benefits, positives and negatives with declining EPA enforcement is that we're probably going to see, more efficiency and bigger problems addressed. Data and technology, I think we're going to see more transparency and increased compliance, and then less federal enforcement. We're going to see more state enforcement and inconsistent state standards. So I'm going to stop there. I was talking for a long time. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them now. I realize we're short on time, so I'm also happy to step out and answer questions in the hallway as well.
Just a quick question regarding